I'm Tim Bradner. Welcome to Capitol Views. We're here today with Attorney General Craig Richards. Craig, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Tim.
And we are in an era of intensive federal intrusion into Alaskan affairs. And one issue which is important is the Endangered Species Act. And maybe, Craig, you could explain why this is important to us?
I could, and the reason I thought it was important to talk about today was because when I came into the Attorney General's office, I really wasn't aware of the scope of, in this particular instance, the grab by the federal government in terms of controlling our coastal waters. And the issue is that the National Marine Fisheries Service has made a policy choice in the mid-2000s to start listing marine mammals as endangered, not based upon current endangerment or current threat, but based upon a model that says there is global warming. Global warming will ultimately result in ice melting. Ice melting will ultimately threaten the species. Therefore, healthy and viable marine species today should be endangered species. And that's occurred now with the polar bear was listed in 2008, the bearded seal and the ring seal into 2012, and the Pacific walrus is up for it as well. And what's really shocking to me when I got into this was the time frame they're using. For the polar bear, they used 45 years. For the ring seal and the bearded seal, they're using 100-year models. So again, they're saying, well, in the next 100 years, ice will melt, that we assume that has an impact on the species, and therefore they should be treated as endangered, even though, for instance, with the bearded seal, you have a population in the hundreds of thousands, and the ring seal, you have a multi-million seal population, so certainly no current threat.
And this is the only justification they're using?
It is. It is a model completely driven on what will be the long-term impacts of global warming on the species. And I brought a graphic. I don't know if we can get that put up or not, but I wanted to show you. So this, for instance, is the Arctic ring seal. And what you have here is a map of the state of Alaska, and that's blue. And red is what the National Marine Fisheries Service wants to dedicate as critical habitat for the ring seal. Now that's basically northern and western Alaska. They're saying that all of that area needs to be specially treated under the Endangered Species Act and essentially set aside for more sophisticated and more complex levels of federal review, including Section 7 consultations. And the consequence is virtually any project that occurs or impacts those waters has to go through this special review process. That can result in projects being shut down. It can result and often does result in very expensive mitigation measures during construction, or alternatively, even mitigation measures during operation, which, if you have to do very expensive mitigation things for the life of a project, it can greatly add to its cost.
Could it affect fisheries?
It already is. It can affect fisheries. Wow. It can affect, obviously, any kind of road or bridge development that occurs near coastal waters, any kind of onshore development where you have drainage or runoff. One example that I heard about was there was an airport that was under construction, and because airplanes were going to fly over certain habitats that were on the water, the airport was suddenly under a Section 7 analysis.
Well, was this in Alaska?
It was.
Where do you recall?
I was just told, let's see if I wrote it down here. No, I didn't write it down. So I don't
obviously
remember.
Western Alaska someplace.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And the thing about a Section 7 analysis is even if the ultimate outcome is reasonable in terms of putting limitations on project, it takes years to go through it. It's extremely expensive for the project. And Tim, as you know, the upfront capital on these projects is the risk capital. It's the most risky time to invest in a project. And if you know that you have to go through the Section 7 compliance process and you don't know if you're going to get out of it, or at least it's going to add years and potentially millions or tens of million dollars to a big project and mitigation costs, you're getting that risk right at the front end, which is the hardest part, at least for private investment projects, to go forward on.
Is this starting to affect projects now?
Well, it hasn't affected projects yet in terms of these 4 listings, the 2 seals, the polar bear, and the walrus, because so far the state, in conjunction with the Alaska Oil and Gas Association, the North Slope Borough, the Northwest Arctic Borough, a few other native corporations and some other native groups, have been successful in essentially attacking the critical habitat listing. The state has worked with their partners in this to file lawsuits challenging the logic and some of the science that went into really saying that, hey, are these animals really endangered today?
Because of a 100-year projection?
It's because of a 100-year projection. It does get pretty technical, like any good lawsuit, it never gets resolved on what you think it should get resolved on. There's some technical point that ends up, winning or losing. In the case of the bearded seal, They just found that there wasn't science. Ralph Weisslein, who I clerk for, found that there wasn't science that supported the idea that just because you're going to have melted sea ice doesn't mean you can assume that 50 years from now that melting is actually going to impact an otherwise currently healthy population, that the federal government didn't sort of have the evidence in the record to demonstrate that.
So are these listings on a stay right now, or what is the current status of them?
Well, the current status is that you've got the listings, but it's not the listing itself that's the critical issue. It's how big you draw that critical habitat.
I see. Yeah.
And like you said, that's virtually, if you saw in the picture, that's the entire Arctic Ocean and all of western Alaska. So what's currently, in terms of the polar bear and the bearded seal, what's on challenge is how big is that habitat going to look like, and what's that going to be? And where the state is now is we currently have to decide whether or not we're going to move forward and attack the critical habitat designation for the ring seal as well. We've done the bearded seal and the polar bear, but not the ring seal.
In the polar bear, we were successful in getting the habitat area shrunken a bit?
So we were kind of successful. The last couple of administrations challenged the actual listing, and that was unsuccessful. But they challenged the size of the designation because I didn't have that particular graphic. But again, it was the entire northern coast of Alaska virtually. And ultimately what the judge in that case ruled was that the National Marine Fisheries Service didn't demonstrate that they followed reasonable criteria in painting the brush so broadly. So it's essentially back for litigation over what should that critical habitat look like in a more nuanced and thought out way.
Yeah, something like climate change, I mean, you could draw any conclusions on something like that far out.
Well, anybody, I'm certainly not a scientific modeler, but I'm a financial modeler. And I understand, the farther you go out, the more assumptions you make, and these tiny little assumptions you make now about any number of things can dramatically impact outcomes projected for 5 years, much less 50 or 100 years.
Yeah, and you just put that in the context of trying to figure what oil prices might be or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a total unknown
right
after a few years. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Craig. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tim Bradner with Capitol Views, and thank you to Attorney General Craig Richards.
Thank you, Tim.